In Kiev, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Rahim Rahemtulla, and in today's press review, we'll look at two articles which suggest that Russia may be trying to bring an end to the conflict in East Ukraine. We begin with Time magazine, in which Simon Schuster writes, "Putin cut Ukraine criticism from speech ahead of peace talks." The piece claims that Russian President Putin cut a, quote, blistering critique of the Ukrainian authorities from a speech to human rights advocates last week. The speech, according to Schuster, was set to include a line in which Putin would accuse Ukraine of, quote, mass destruction of its own citizens. Schuster says that Time contacted Putin's spokesman about the omission. Asked whether the change signaled a shift in Putin's position on Ukraine, Dmitry Peskov said, "No, absolutely not." But Schuster argues that Russia's position on Ukraine has softened and says that Putin is already taking a more conciliatory approach as a result of pressure from the West. He quotes former Kremlin advisor Gleb Pavlovsky, who says the turn on the Ukraine issue is clear, even obvious. Putin now wants to strengthen the message of friendliness, and the Kremlin is trying in various ways to turn down the heat on the Ukraine issue. We turn now to a piece in Britain's Guardian newspaper from Simon Tisdall, which carries the headline, "Russia's tough rhetoric over Ukraine does not tell the whole story." While Moscow appears publicly defiant, behind the scenes there are efforts to find a way out of the crisis. Tisdall argues that the Kremlin is now engaged in behind-the-scenes maneuvering in order to find a way out of the conflict in East Ukraine. He says increasing economic pressure on Russia as a result of Western sanctions is beginning to tell. He writes, "Putin and his circle have an unwritten social contract with the Russian people. The regime provides rising living standards and economic prosperity. In return, citizens do not question too closely its undemocratic and authoritarian behavior. But this tacit deal is breaking down." But Tisdall goes on to say that a Russian collapse would have negative consequences for everyone, not only Russians. In his opinion, Eurozone countries worried about a new recession privately hope an easing of the Ukraine conflict will allow the lifting of mutually damaging EU sanctions when they are reviewed next July. And despite Putin's paranoid claims, a sudden, unpredictable Russian meltdown is not in US interests. And so it would seem that there is now some agreement among commentators that US and European pressure on Russia, combined with the falling price for oil, is starting to affect decision-making in the Kremlin. It remains to be seen if that will translate into improvements in the situation in East Ukraine. The challenge for Western leaders appears to be knowing when to pull back. They want to avoid a major political or economic collapse in Russia, which would undoubtedly have repercussions that would reach well beyond the country's borders. In Kiev, this is Ukraine Today, and that wraps up our press review.